So I think we can start now, and hopefully others would log on, and then would just join us as we go along. So I just wanted to do a little introduction about who we are, A4AI. Some of you already know us, but just for the sake of those who are coming to meet us for the first time or joining us for the first time, we are the broadest technology alliance in the world. We are the leading advocates for affordable internet in the world. We are made up of private sector, governments, and civil society working together in policy and regulatory reform to drive down the cost of broadband across the world. And we work mainly in 3 regions. We work in developing regions, but we work in Latin America, Africa, and in Asia, working closely with local partners and our coalitions to drive down the cost of broadband through policy and regulatory reform. So thank you for joining us wherever you are in the world, whether you're in lockdown, coming out of lockdown, or probably going into another lockdown, I don't know. But I just hope you're safe, and of course, if you have connectivity, then you're able to join us. So thank you for coming to this webinar. So without much ado, I'll just go straight to why we are here. As you know, there are over 3.5 billion people who are unconnected in the world. And as COVID-19 has shown, connectivity is more than ever a very important lifeline. And a lot of people are unconnected, but we see this more dire in rural areas. And we started having this conversation even before COVID-19. So this framework you're going to be showcasing, which was launched in February, actually started before COVID-19. We didn't know that there was COVID-19 going to come, but this has just even shown why this framework is very important in the policy, in influencing policy and regulation across the world, if we really, really want to make sure that the last mile, the last billions are connected, and that everybody has access to broadband at least by 2030. So I have very interesting speakers lined up. I will start with Sonia, who's going to set the stage. She's going to give us a background of why we came up with this framework, this policy framework, and then we'll dive into the applicability of the elements of the framework. We have Mike Johnson, who is from APC. As you know, this framework was developed in partnership with several other organizations who also share the same interests that we have. We have APC, who were partners with us, and then the Digital Empowerment Forum as well, based in India. Facebook, of course, were one of the partners, and CIPESA from Uganda. And then, so all of them came together to contribute towards this framework that we are going to be showcasing and speaking about today. So without much ado, I'll just go straight to Sonia to start and set the stage for us. And then I'll come back to the panel that we have lined up to speak to them and also hear how this can be applied in real life. Sonia, if you're ready.
Thank you, Eleanor. That's great. Thank you for the introduction. You already saved me 30 seconds of my 7 minutes allotted. So as Eleanor said, for us at A4AI, the concern for rural broadband has been one that is definitely not new, but is one that has been exacerbated in the last few years, especially because, as you all know, working at the country level in all of the different regions of the world, it has become clearly apparent to us that rural areas, despite efforts at the national policy level, are continuing staying behind in many different ways. Regardless of which way you look at it, either because of infrastructure, either because of density, either because of affordability, the demographics of the areas. The reality is that rural areas continue to not be the kinds of beneficiaries that we would wish to see. And so A4AI and our partners at APC, the Digital Empowerment Foundation, CIPESA, and Facebook came together to try to make sense of it all and say, based on our experience, what is it that we as an alliance, as collaborators, could bring together to really, in a way, bring clarity to what policymakers need to think differently. How do policymakers need to act differently to focus their actions on rural broadband and really make a dent? So next slide, please, Michael. And the next one. So as we came together and started thinking about how to highlight the importance of focusing on rural areas, of course, the first item is to recognize that rural areas are indeed behind. And this is not just because we see it, but that's what the data shows. And so many of you on this call have the experience. You know, as you can see, even with just a small sample of countries for which ITU gathers data of urban versus rural, the reality of rural connectivity is very different than in urban areas, okay? This is a small sample of 15 countries in the global south. And as you can see, penetration of broadband and internet in households is far smaller in rural areas. So this is a concern. And what it tells us is that, next slide, please. What it tells us is that we need, again, to have very targeted actions to focus on improving the situation in rural areas. There's a couple of ways in which we can do that, but something that was important to A4AI and our partners to be clear from the outset is that any policy in any country that intends to focus on rural development must satisfy 6 criteria to become successful, okay? And this is very important so that we make sure that things are not being developed just from that kind of national neutral perspective, but indeed are specific to those rural areas' needs. One, improve the availability of connectivity, specifically to rural areas. We are not talking about national targets. We're not talking about broadband policy that talks about just simply expanding infrastructure regardless of where it is. We're talking about saying and committing to the infrastructure that is going to be invested in will be for rural areas and underserved areas. So that very clear intention in the policymaking process. Of course, draw from real world experience, and we will hear actually from our partners today precisely about how their experience has not only informed this framework, but is a demonstration of what can be done when rural areas are indeed the focus. Harness the resources of not just the kind of standard, let's call dominant private sector operators, but primarily of complementary providers who are the ones most likely not only inclined to serve rural areas, but frankly also better prepared to serve rural areas. Be comprehensive in terms of addressing affordability, but also the demand needs, the needs of the users. Be gender responsive. The gender digital divide is absolutely a concern to us all, and it's getting worse. And if rural development does not address the gender divide, it will simply not do a disservice to rural areas, period. So we need to make sure that policies are very aware in that way. And then, of course, utilize evidence and standards that are not just accepted by all, but clear for everyone. Next slide, please. In addition to satisfying those key criteria to make it successful, it's really important, and as you all know at the Alliance, for us, participation and collaboration are key to success. And so it's very important for us that any kind of process that leads to rural broadband policies, one that is grounded on broad participation, alliances, and coalition building, that is transparent in the decision-making process, and that it allows stakeholders to participate meaningfully, meaning it's not just about creating the space for collaboration, but also creating the opportunity for engagement, participation, and in fact, investment, and etc. So beyond just developing the policy, but being part of the policy implementation. It's also very important that that process is fair And so for us, as you know, based on your experience with A4AI, it's important that we keep ourselves accountable throughout the process, and that we are very clear about that process and making adjustments as needed, because frankly, we all learn as we go. And it's important that we recognize when things are not taking place the way we expected. If there are failures or adjustments are needed, we need to be able to address them. So recognizing the need to do that, it's really important for all stakeholders as we go forth. Next slide, please. And so as we developed the framework, thinking about all of these elements, we spent a lot of time understanding, so what would be the key elements of a framework that would drive rural development in a way that would be not just productive, but frankly also to provide a guide to policymakers and those involved in such a way that they could see, okay, here we are, I'm in this particular context in my country, in my region, and there are different kinds of elements that I need to think about. Which ones have I already addressed? Which ones have I not addressed properly? And for each of those, where are the gaps? So we hope that the elements of this framework that we've developed, plus what will come next, will serve as a playbook and a kind of a toolkit that will allow all players to understand not only where they are in their process and intention of supporting rural development policy, but also having very concrete actions that they can take to allow them to contribute to that process of rural development. So we developed in detail 7 different kinds of elements. We are actually based on input that we got from not only the partners, but others that joined us when we initially launched the event back in February, are planning on adding an additional element focusing on monitoring and evaluation and that kind of feedback loop process that I was just mentioning to you, because we think it's important to add that to the framework. But now the framework has these 7 elements that you see on the slide. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through all of them because we want to hear from our participants, but I'll mention just 2 so that you understand how these work for us. So think about competition. We start with competition because we see that that's important, but the reality is that competition has failed rural areas. Otherwise, we wouldn't be where we are with that kind of household penetration of only 14%, as you saw in one of the earlier slides. So it's important to recognize that while we want to start with a competitive outcome, we need to recognize that that competitive outcome, as it is defined in the sector currently, is not sufficient for rural areas. So we need to actually change the policy approach to competition, to lower barriers to new entrants, to alternative providers, those complementary providers that we will be talking about later, but specifically things like community networks, rural cooperatives, smaller and medium-sized businesses that can become the new business models that come into play in rural areas to fill in that very important gap. Another one are things, for example, spectrum, effective spectrum management. It's very clear that rural areas not only have very specific needs because of their context and their realities, but in terms of infrastructure, income, etc. But also the fact is, it's important that the policy space allows for utilizing things like unlicensed spectrum or spectrum that is not being used but is allocated to different providers, but that alternative providers can actually take full advantage of that to provide services to users. So having a way to be more refined and more specific in the policy to facilitate the opportunities of rural development is very important. And what this framework does is provide that initial guide and stage on how to adjust the policy framework so that it's focused in rural areas and actually provides additional opportunities that currently are not there, or that the current regulatory framework, because it is a bit outdated or based on legacy approaches, does not reflect. So the intention is really to push policy that focuses on rural areas in a way that is much more forward-looking, but also that reflects this approach of addressing the gaps that are very serious in rural areas. Next slide. I'm sorry if I cannot cover all of them, but I can assure you that our panelists will cover many of these other aspects as we go, and then we can cover them in the discussions. But just briefly, so you have an idea what to expect in the near future, our team is already working on a number of different projects that will build onto this framework, not only selected case studies to illustrate the different elements in action, and you can already see a couple of them on the dedicated web page on our website. This is continuously being built. So do use it as a resource and reach out to our team as you need. We are already in the process of creating a more sophisticated web-based tool that will have not only all of the elements of the framework, different kinds of tools, etc., but also will have the playbook that we are developing currently to support all policymakers, private sector, and civil society on how to engage with the framework. And lastly, but not least, and this is an example of that, really sharing with all of you through seminars, workshops, webinars, what we can collectively do to push a rural development agenda. And we hope that this is useful for you. So I'll pass it on to you, Eleanor, and I hope I didn't take too much more of my time. Thank you.
You were brilliant, Sonia. Thank you so much. And I mean, I hope that you've all seen we've set the stage now of how we came about with these elements and the partnership that was involved in getting to this stage. So how applicable are these elements and the processes that we've just lined up in this framework? And to start off, I would bring in Mike Jensen. Mike is with the Association of Progressive Communications. And he's going to give us examples, real life case studies of how this has been applied, mainly in the regions that they work. So Mike, if you can hear me, please go ahead.
Thanks, Eleanor. I hope you can hear me all right.
Yes, I can hear you. And I'll please encourage everyone else to mute so that we don't have that echo in the background. Thank you.
It was probably me. Anyway, yes, I guess I'd like to start off by observing that I think we're now in the beginning of what I would term the third wave of telecommunications development. We've seen the first wave being the national fixed line operators, usually owned by government back in the, well, from the turn of the century up until probably the late 70s. Subsequent to that, we then had the second wave, which I think is typified by the emergence of the national mobile network operators and their promise or expectation that they would actually provide the solution to internet connectivity throughout the world. I think we're beginning to see that that model is not necessarily going to be applicable everywhere, especially at the edges of the network in developing countries, in rural and particularly isolated situations. And this is where I think we're now seeing the emergence of a variety of new initiatives and models and platforms to provide connectivity in these more difficult locations that are not don't provide a sufficient return on investment to justify mobile operators really providing adequate, affordable broadband in these areas. So I'm not sure how much of you know about the APC, but we started off as being a network of national internet access providers for the nonprofit sector back in 1990. And then as the commercial internet emerged, a number of our members focused more on the soft issues around ensuring that the internet is available equitably for everyone at a policy level, and focusing on human rights issues related to the internet, such as online gender-based violence or internet shutdowns, and many of the other issues which you're probably quite well familiar with. Now, what happened was a couple of years ago, we noticed that we were having an increasing number of members joining us that had been deploying their own infrastructure. And we thought that this was quite interesting and potentially a revolutionary idea. So back in 2018, the International Development Research Center of Canada supported APC to do a global study of these small bottom-up community-based networks that we were finding as members and increasingly finding around the world in developing country situations. So just to give you a taste of a couple of examples of these, could you switch to the first slide, please, Eleanor? So yes, there in Argentina, we have a member called Altamundi, who has been running now for more than 6 or 7 years, I believe, a community-based Wi-Fi network where every household funds the purchase of their own router, which costs about $100, and then contributes to a monthly fund of about $5 a month to support the cost of internet access and the replacement of devices which inevitably fail at some point in these situations. So they even got as far as developing their own router to best make use of this kind of mesh networking environment that they found most applicable to this kind of rural remote network conditions that they have in Argentina. So there we see about 6 villages now with 100 households, all gaining good quality internet access for a very low price. This is probably the most common type of community-based network that we encountered around the world. We studied about 15 or 20 of them across the global south in the course of 2018. The other interesting one is now the emergence of community-based GSM or mobile network services. So perhaps you could move to the next slide, please. One of our members is called Rhizomatica, and they're based in Mexico. And they've been supporting the emergence of a federation of small-scale community-based mobile networks. There are about 14 of them at least now, perhaps more since the study was done, in 60 different municipal localities. They have about 4,000 users a day, and they manage to pay only $2.50 a month for unlimited local calls and unlimited incoming calls. Then they pay a small surcharge to use a voice provider for long distance calls. And there the setup of a mobile network is less than $10,000. So you can see that there is the possibility for small, low income communities to establish their own mobile and fixed voice and internet infrastructure. I think what's interesting about these models is that they also support the involvement of women in a big way, we found. And we also found that they had a public access component in many cases to address the issue that many people can't afford access devices, especially in the very low income countries. Synergies with community radio is another big area. And I think that's important to note because we're seeing the convergence of broadcasting and interactive networks such as the internet in a greater way. I think the two issues of constraint are access to energy. We found a lot of the networks having to look at higher cost implementations of solar powered panels, for example, because there is no grid power. So policy issues also need to address that aspect. And then, of course, access to spectrum was a huge constraint in many cases. We found innovative use of TV white space in a couple of locations, but often they were unable to continue them because of the restrictions placed on them by the regulators. And the policy environment we generally found needed to be addressed, in particular also in the area of backhaul. The high cost of backhaul was probably the biggest cost component of many of these networks and affects their affordability to the greatest extent. So policies around infrastructure sharing and deployment of open access fiber backbones, for example, are a key factor in making sure that these kinds of networks can be affordable. I think I should probably leave it at there and focus on the question time. Thanks, Eleanor.
Thank you so much, Mike. And it's so interesting to see how we are leveraging the elements that speaks about looking at innovative solutions and complementary solutions in order to bridge that rural gap. So I'm glad that you're able to bring these examples, particularly from Latin America, to see how these can be applied in a policy and regulatory space in actual projects that are being worked on. So the next speaker is Anelka Nandi. She's with the Digital Empowerment Foundation, and she's going to give us a lot of examples from the Asia context. So Anelka, please go ahead.
Thank you, Eleanor, and thank you for having me. I would like to first of all, begin with DF's experience with implementing community networks and convening community network exchanges as platforms for knowledge sharing and learning for our colleagues from Asia Pacific and Central Asia. So even though India is one of the fastest growing markets for internet adoption, there is quite a lot of existing digital inequality. For example, the digital density in rural areas is 25.4 versus 97.9 in urban areas. And this difference was even stark when we started off with the pilot of our wireless for communities way back in 2009, actually. So we were implementing a digital development program in one of the weaver and artisan clusters in Chanderi, which is a mountainous area, essentially. And one of the biggest roadblocks that we faced was there was hardly any access to internet at that point of time. So we started working on, developing models that would enable us to bridge that gap. And Chanderi became our pilot site for implementing community networks and the Wireless for Communities program, essentially. So the Wireless for Community program essentially works to provide internet access in areas where it is not commercially viable for mainstream internet service providers to be present. It primarily connects rural and geographically remote areas. It uses line of sight, low-cost Wi-Fi equipment, and unlicensed spectrum, which is 2.4 gigahertz and 5.8 gigahertz in India, essentially, to bring the communities together. So there are 4 key components through which we implement a Wireless for Communities program. First, we identify individuals from the communities who are trained in wireless network technologies, and we refer to them as barefoot wireless engineers. And then the next step is to then deploy the wireless technology, and also at the same time, advocate for greater community ownership and management of the infrastructure and maintenance of the infrastructure. So the initial deployment and setup of the infrastructure is usually through grants and funds. However, taking it forward and ensuring sustainability of the network is then transferred to the communities who are then tasked to own and manage the network. Right. So over nearly 10 years of deployment, we have tried to adapt our approach to a variety of different contexts. For example, one was in the little run of Kutch, which is a very arid and difficult terrain in the western part of the country. It is a salt marsh essentially. And over there, it is very difficult. So over there, we kind of tried a model of mobile vehicles, of using internet in a box for mobile vehicles, which then moved around and kind of tried to expand the area under coverage, area of internet access there. So over here, the vehicles that were used were specially designed. They had solar panel rooftops. They had inbuilt digital equipment essentially, and they had a tower that could rotate 360 degrees essentially, and kind of was able to latch on or align with the broadband internet tower, which was in the periphery of the van, of the vehicle essentially. So excuse me. So the which was called the wireless Agadias, essentially this vehicle that you're seeing over here on the slide. It essentially helped the Agaria community, which was present in the run of Kutch, which are located in the run of Kutch, essentially, to access social protection, have alternative mediums of access to information, or connect 17 around Ran Shalas or makeshift schools to each other throughout the internet. For example, so it also supported one of the primary health centers over there to remain connected to the internet and provide quick and quality consultations. And then moving on from that model, we have now kind of tried to integrate the wireless for communities model within our mainstream, within some of our flagship programs, which is the Smart Village program. We have, kind of gone ahead with, based on their experience in learning, we've developed modules and training materials and resources for barefoot wireless engineers for easy upscaling and replication. The Wireless for Communities model was also recognized by the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India as one of the exemplars of providing public Wi-Fi. Apart from DEF, there are two other models. Apart from the DEF model of community networks, there are two other models that are operational in India. One is Air Jaldi, which is essentially a national Class A ISP, which started off as a social enterprise and now is present, and now has 10 networks across 6 Indian states. The other is Gram Marg, which is an initiative of the IIT Bombay, which was testing a commercial franchisee model of using TV white space to provide backhaul connectivity to Wi-Fi hotspots and kiosks. So along with DEF and our colleagues and partners, the kind of constraints that we feel is the compliance responsibilities in the telecom sector are just too onerous for small service providers. And nowadays, the 2.4 spectrum essentially has become very noisy in the urban areas because it's essentially crowded with utilities that use the same spectrum space, like microwaves or cordless telephones or Bluetooth devices. And the 5.2 gigahertz essentially has a high absorption rate. Even though it has a wire bandwidth, it has a high absorption rate. So there's a substantial bit of signal loss there. Also, just to file for a license is too onerous for a small service provider. And what would be particularly helpful, especially if there are shared infrastructures, there are inclusive licensing arrangements that allow small service providers to partake and provide services while at the same time reducing the burden of compliance and cost component on them. Further, the government has a Digital India initiative where they're trying to connect 250 village councils, 250,000 village councils all across India. And however, when we did the spot check, we found it was only 18% of the folks we surveyed had those services installed, and only 11% had those services functional. And even if they were functional, they were slow and available for only a couple of hours a day. So, the government has an investing capacity in infrastructure, and the civil society has a proof of concept in terms of trying and testing its models. So probably, if this investing capacity of the government could be combined with the learnings of the civil society and kind of make sure that these are combined together and integrated in providing access to rural areas, I think that would work towards providing and expanding coverage over there. And sometimes what we have learned from our experiences and interactions with our colleagues and partners from other national contexts is, for example, in Philippines, there is no unlicensed spectrum there. In Myanmar, the unlicensed spectrum is under consideration. So even if we were to kind of pitch for a community network style model, I think there are substantial roadblocks across national legislation, across national contexts, even within Asia. I mean, contexts and realities even within Asia. So that is something that we probably need to think about. So that's where I would end. And thank you for having me, and I look forward to the discussions to follow.
Thank you very much, Ananelka. It's so refreshing to see all these examples coming through from India, and to see how you've been able to drive demand, being able to surmount some of the challenges, licensing, regulatory, in order to set up some of these very complementary services, internet service providers as well. And what I see that from your discussion, what you just mentioned was the need to have more partnership and to also have better streamlining of regulations and policies, which is exactly what we've been speaking about in the elements that we have in the framework. So this is a perfect time to move to the next presenter, Kujo Boache from Facebook. Kujo will be speaking about some of the applicability of the framework in the line of work he does, mainly in Africa. And Kujo, thank you for joining us, and please take it away.
Thanks. I'm gonna, there's about 44 people on the call. I'm gonna disappoint some people and leave some elated. I don't have slides, but I am gonna speak very briefly to some of the work that Facebook has done, probably with a focus in the Africa region, because that's where I work, but mindful that we have done much of this work all over the world. And I'm gonna speak, I'll probably mention some of those projects without it being a sales pitch, but also I think I'm going to highlight some of the reasons why we feel that the partnerships we've tried to develop, the efforts we've tried to make, and therefore the infrastructure that we've tried to provide in partnership with others has been held back. And then I've noticed on the chat, lots of people are asking for slides and references. I will commit myself and my team to be able to provide people with videos and further information about some of these efforts. So the first thing I'll say, and it was really good to hear Mike after a very long time. I haven't heard you for a long time, Mike, so hi. Speak about the challenges with backhaul and the way that these actually undermine the community networks that are referred to in the report, but also spoken to by our first two speakers. And what I will say is that I think Facebook understands this challenge. I think we've focused on open access, long haul, backhaul fiber provision with partners in the Africa region, certainly since my time with Facebook, which is now 3.5 years. And I can mention some of what we've done. So in Uganda, we've built nigh on 800 kilometers of fiber in northern Uganda, in a region that many felt didn't have sufficient demand for 3G and 4G there, and therefore didn't need the backhaul fiber that we were bringing. And we did that in partnership with Airtel and a company called BCS. It won't surprise many on this call that not only was that network successfully rolled out, but pretty quickly, the provider there, Airtel, noticed that demand was much higher than it had anticipated. And most of its sites, if not all of them, were quickly switched to 3 and 4G. And I think this speaks to what the report speaks about, which is not only the need to provide people with connectivity, but also for that to be meaningful connectivity. And I'm thankful that A4AI is one of those organizations that's thinking about meaningful connectivity. So there's a successful build in Uganda, and please do remember Uganda. We've also had undertaken successful builds, again in partnerships, and big shout to Funke at Main One and her company for the partnership and build that we did in Edo and Ogun State, Nigeria, where we provided about 750 kilometers, again providing at least facilitating metro provision, but also providing that foundation towards rural provision as well. And then I could speak to some of the build that we've completed in DRC. I think I could smile and say, this is fantastic. Look at what Facebook is doing. Look at what partners it's doing in partnership with companies like Main One and BCS and our partners in the DRC as well. But I think for me, it comes with a tinge of disappointment, because I'm mindful that these partnerships could have gone further and done much more, but for some of the problems that have been mentioned in A4AI's framework. So the rights of way issue that I know is an issue in much of the continent and elsewhere has been a challenge for us. And being able to manage that in places like Nigeria and DRC has been difficult at times. And it's something that I think the A4AI report rightfully calls out, asking for not only for governments to get a grip of it, but also to probably have a ceiling on what the price of rights of way may be, and also to facilitate partners like us getting rights of way as quickly as possible. I'll speak to developing partnerships very briefly as well. I think there are lots of companies that want to partner, and we've found them, and in many cases, but in some cases, partnerships have been difficult to develop. And sometimes we found that there are existing obligations that companies have that make it difficult for them to partner in other innovative ways. There are existing competitive dynamics that prevent partners from partnering as well, or seemingly do that. And I think that's on governments where necessary to incentivize partnerships, but also on the private sector to think about the long term and the end goal here, which is to move beyond the low hanging fruit that we have captured as an industry in many ways, and on to where else we need to go. And I encourage people to do that. And then very, very quickly, and this is in some instances, and not in the countries I've mentioned actually, but in other places where my belief is Facebook and partners would have gone on to roll out networks, is where in some cases governments have developed networks, and that has become a block for the private sector's provision of these backhaul networks, and that continues to be a challenge. The A4AI report mentions taxation in a number of ways, and I was struck by the call for people to adopt the appropriate tax regimes and fees, etc. And this report, and I know A4AI has called this out, doesn't talk about the question of digital taxation and how some countries are approaching that. And the reason why I asked people to remember when I mentioned our Uganda build, is that Uganda, unfortunately, remains the only country in the world at this point in time in which someone living in a rural area who may be part of that 14% of people that the A4AI calls out in less developed countries would have to pay 5 cents before they were able to use Skype or YouTube or WhatsApp or whatever else. And this is, as the Uganda Communications Commission evidence from last year suggests, creates huge challenges to getting online. And that piece of taxation, those issues with digital taxes, whether that be on mobile devices, which is a tax that DRC, I believe, has just debated, or a tax on services like those provided by my company, are all things that government should think carefully about. And I think, again, it's about this end game. I think Derek, my friend from the chamber, is on the call, and I think Kwaku Sachi-Addo had a great phrase when we worked in the early days on the establishment of the Ghana coalition. Shout out to the coalitions that are on the call at the moment, coalition members. And it spoke to, and I won't say it as eloquently as Kwaku, but he spoke about killing or breaking one's eggs before they hatch. And in some cases, some of the tax models being introduced are breaking the eggs of Africa, if you want to call it that, before they hatch. And I think actually in a time of COVID, it's important to mention how important connectivity has been, not just for, and I'll land in a moment, sorry to take so long, Eleanor, not just for helping people navigate the dangers of, helping people who use the connectivity themselves to navigate the dangers posed by COVID, to understand how to stay safe. And we see the disparity where if you don't have connectivity, you won't have access to the information centers that Facebook has established in more than 40 plus countries in Africa. If you turn on your Facebook, you'll see an info center on how to protect yourself from COVID. Many, if in rural areas, won't have that. But also there's a point that the A4AI report mentions about data. One point is about governments having and being transparent and providing open data about issues of connectivity that private sector players or community, those who develop community networks, might be able to use in order to better establish networks. But it's also about the data that's derived in some cases by mobile operators, or that they hold, or indeed like by companies like mine, that becomes extremely useful when it comes to monitoring the impact of breakouts like this, whether that be Ebola, whether that be COVID, and again, focused on the Africa region, how that data might be used. And I think we've seen already in this instance, and some of the partnerships that Facebook has got involved in with regional players and with governments and with CSOs in the region, how important it is that the data derived from those who use the internet, whether it be the disaster prevention maps that we've been able to create, or the mobility data that's being used by various universities and institutions now on the continent, how important that becomes for us monitoring diseases, and how important it may become for us as we try to work on other issues of development. And I know that A4AI report speaks importantly to how the connectivity in rural areas might become a foundational peg in how we might develop health institutions and other infrastructure that's so important for livelihood. So I thought that was a great shout in this particular report, and I did want to mention that in the midst of COVID. Finally, 1 second, Eleanor, very, very quickly, because the report does speak to the demand side, and I think techies like us often, not techies, but people who work in this area often think about the supply side before the demand side. And I know the report shouts about that piece and mentions the need for companies to have agents who might help people get online. And I did want to mention that this is something that Facebook has been thinking about for a long time in places like Indonesia, in places like Zambia, and I can cite others. We've worked with mobile operators to take people through something that we've often called Internet 101, where when you get a SIM card, you are taken through how to use your mobile, how to use the internet, how to use Facebook, how to report bad information, how to befriend people, how to protect yourself in terms of privacy as well, in a really, really short lesson, which has proved really impactful for hundreds of thousands of people, not only in Africa, but I know also in Asia as well. And I thought that was a great shout about the need to have people in place to help stimulate demand, but also to help them use the internet to its optimum. So thanks so much for listening, everybody.
Thank you, Kojo. And our final speaker is actually unable to join us because she's been disappointed by her electricity supplier. So Lillian, who's based in Uganda, she sent a message to us that she's had challenges with her electricity. And it's so interesting to see how we are seeing a correlation between power supply and the access to broadband and connectivity. And I think that this is one of some of the challenges that we need to confront when we're talking about rural connectivity. We also have to look at the issues of power, but not in this forum now. So it just gives us a bit more time to have a discussion. We have about 11 minutes to have a discussion. And I think we would just do this. I would look at the, if you have your hand up, I believe you can, there is a Zoom function for raising your hand if you want to ask a question or make a comment. I would just plead that you keep it very brief. Just make it succinct, go to the point, and so that we can be able to have time to answer all the questions. So if you have a hand up, Michael, are you able to see the hands that are up?
Yes, but no one has their hand up now.
Right, okay, so I think we can go to the first question that I see in the chat. What is the definition of broadband as considered in this framework?
Sonia? Eleanor,
yes.
Yes, sorry. I can answer that quickly, but there's other questions that actually answered on the chat. So there's quite a few questions there. Some have been answered, some not, you'll see. So on the definition of broadband for everyone, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the meaningful connectivity standard that A4AI has been working on. So it's based on the assumption of a 4G speed for broadband. I think the question came from Riku. So I invite you to look at that. And that definition has also been used in a couple of other reports and research that we are doing with a couple of other partners. So I'm happy to provide more details, but if you look at our meaningful connectivity standard, you will see there in the justification for it as well. Thank you, Eleanor.
Thank you. So I don't see a hand up, but if there is any other question in the chat, because I'm just going through the list, but if there is any other question in the chat, any of the speakers who wants to pick up, please feel free to do that whilst I try to see if there are any questions coming up through the participants list.
Eleanor, there was a question for Kojo and others, but there was a question for Kojo around open telecom data and the maps of Facebook infrastructure in Uganda and elsewhere. There might be, and it's obviously also an important element of the framework that infrastructure should be made available and maps should be made available so that we make the best of it. So that might be something that Kojo might want to address. And there's a couple of others further down on the chat.
Okay, I don't have access to the chat. I've actually had that question a few times, and I think I saw Steve. I think Steve's one of those people that asked the question a few times. I think one of the natures of Facebook's partnerships is that some of the information that partners want to share may not be in line with what Facebook wants to share, and some of the information that Facebook wants to share may not be in line with what partners want to share. So on that particular question, I think the jury's still out on where on when we'll share the maps of the various networks across Africa. But as soon as I have that, I'll be able to share that with you. And I know Steve's asked that question before, and I may have had that question in other places as well. I think the jury's still out on when we'll share those.
Kojo, perhaps you could shed some light on why that information wants to be protected. So operators want to protect that information and not want to share it.
Yeah, Mike, I don't want to speak to speak to each operator. And as I said, it may be us, it may be operators, but I don't want to speak for each operator. But again, as I mentioned, competitive dynamics in some cases, sharing where a backhaul is can give people an indication of where your base stations are and therefore where demand is in some cases. But again, I wouldn't want to speak on behalf of operators on this in this situation. And with regard to the builds that we've undertaken, I'd need clarity on whether it's us that doesn't want to share or the operator partners. So I wouldn't want to put words in their mouths.
I think Sebastian, you have your hand up. Sebastian?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Please go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you, Eleanor. Well, thank you, Sonia. Congratulations for the good work. Thank you for the invitation and for presenting the webinar. And congratulations also to all the presenters. I think it was great. Great presentations and great to discuss and talk more about this. Is so important for us. My name is Sebastian Kaplan from Facebook Connectivity Policy Latin America. I have a question for the presenters, just a general thought or general question for them. I think we're all talking about the importance of rural access, rural connectivity in our regions. How do you see the importance of partnering with the different stakeholders towards reaching this goal? Is it something that you consider relevant, essential to carry along all these projects and fulfilling the objectives of them? How do you think about it? Any thoughts about it? Thank you. Thank you very much.
Any takers? Mike?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I didn't quite understand it.
Sure. Thank you, Mike. Along the needs to fulfill rural connectivity, how do you see the importance of partnering with the different stakeholders towards reaching this goal? Do you think it can be reached by one project, by one company? Like, for example, they mentioned the Mexico project, the Argentina project. Do you think the importance of these projects are going to fulfill by one project, by one company? Or do you feel that the way to reach the potential of these projects is by partnering with different stakeholders and different organizations? Like the one, I can give you a case. I don't want to expand about it, but we have a case in Latin America, in Peru, called Internet para Todos, IPT, where different stakeholders partnered. Facebook partnered with CAF, IDB, and an operator like Telefonica. And with support of the government, we launched a project to connect over 6 million people in rural areas in Peru. And the main, I would say one of the main pillars of this project was not only the policy that we could bring together, but also partnering with different stakeholders. In different regions in the world, in different projects that you've seen, has this impacted, was this relevant? It was not. Any views about partnering with different stakeholders to reach this goal? Thank you.
Thanks. Good question. I think the devil's in the detail in many cases. We see such variety across the different regions that, I'd be hesitant to generalize. And also, I think we have to be clear about what partnering means. Are these equal partnerships, or is this, some sort of piggyback by a person or an entity with less power, piggybacking on some larger operator, or is this larger operators exploiting less powerful clients? So I think we have to be clear about what the partnership is. I mean, yes, we hear a lot about public-private partnerships. If we're talking simply about partnering on developing a better regulatory environment, that's clear. I mean, for me, I think that's the key issue, is having an environment that is more conducive to a variety of different models. So in that respect, it's clear. When we're talking about backbone infrastructure, again, obviously, it makes a huge amount of sense for the large national operators to partner on the deployment of fiber backbones, because the cost of the civil works is 90% of the overall cost. So if that can only be done once, and all the operators can make use of that. And similarly, towers themselves are a huge part of the cost. So partnership on the construction or ownership of a tower, or segmenting the market, as we're seeing in this kind of third wave devolution into wholesale operators and small scale operators, and operators serving different niche markets. Again, if they can all have a low cost infrastructure on which to depend, that's based on the sharing the cost and maximizing the economies of scale, then we have a better solution. For the very tiny villages, they really require partnership in terms of the capital expenditure to get the networks off the ground. I think that's their biggest cost and their biggest difficulty. But again, there's not much point in focusing on those kinds of partnerships if the backhaul costs are so high, and if the burdens of the regulatory environment in terms of the licensing fees and the requirements for reporting are too high, then of course there's not much point in trying to make those networks sustainable without the underlying environment. And so that's kind of why I like the broadband framework, because it emphasizes the fact that this is a whole package. It's not a piecemeal menu that you can pick and choose from, but you need all of those components to make the conducive ecosystem work for everyone. Thanks.
Great point. A great point, Mike. And Anelka, did you want to comment a bit on the partnership bit?
Right. I mean, Mike covered it very comprehensively, but we do try to, draw synergies with, for example, community radios or local NGOs, for example, to become local service providers. So I wasn't sure if your question about partnership had those iterations in mind. But apart from that, because since they're rooted in the communities, they become the natural nodes for providing access to the said community in a given location, to anchor that initiative in a given location. But apart from that, I mean, I second Mike in the comments that he made in response.
Can I just add to that? Can I just add to that, Pete? I do feel we hear a lot about partnerships, and I think Mike is absolutely right about what he says, the devil is in the detail. But without wanting to sound airy-fairy, I will say that an atmosphere of partnership is extremely important. I think, as I alluded to, I think in some countries we could have, as partners, have done more if there was a greater desire for partnership. And I do think that really needs to underpin everything, whether that's from the big players, national operators, or the Facebooks of this world, or in the communities as we've heard today. Partnerships is key to moving things forward. So did want to add that piece.
Very important. And Kuja, there are more questions for you in the chat, but I'm sure you see that. There's one, they still want more answers from you regarding the openness of or transparency for infrastructure that is deployed. So do you want to comment on that?
No, I think, as I said, I think if I was in a situation, it'd be far better and easier for me to say, I will provide all the maps. I think if I was in a situation and our partnerships enabled us to, and we wanted to, then we'd share them. What I will do, and I was glad to see so many friends and colleagues on this line, and hopefully people know me, is that if we are in a position to share them, A4AI is one of the platforms where we'd share them first, as well as with some of the partners who have already asked. So we will share them when we get the opportunity to.
Right. So I think that we've just gone a little bit over the time, but thank you all. I don't see any more hands up. So I presume that everyone is very happy with the conversation that we've had. And I think just going back to what the speakers have mentioned, that this framework, it's not one that you choose, it's a choose and pick. It's not a menu that but it's a holistic. And I think we need to approach it that way. It's also very important to look at the issue of participation, and this is, if you really want this process to be able to bridge that gap, go beyond those the 14.7% who just have connectivity in rural areas, then we need to do a lot more better in reaching out to ensure that we have broad participation, ensure that there's transparency in decision making. As well, and then allow for stakeholders to meaningfully participate in this process. And so I will encourage all of you to please go to our website, www.a4ai.org. We do have the framework there. We also do have applications, and we are going to be building up on the case studies that you've seen, some of which you've seen today in this presentation. And so it's work in progress, really, and we encourage you to reach out to us and see how you can work with us in order to make sure that we're able to reach out to those who are really unconnected and who at this time in this time of crisis need connectivity even more than ever. So thank you all for your time. Please stay safe and continue to engage. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My colleague Michael, who has been working behind the scenes. Michael, thank you so much. You've been really instrumental in setting up this webinar. Thank you.